Good morning, everybody. Welcome and thanks to all who have joined us for what is sure to be a very interesting and discussion about anti-Semitism in American politics and lessons that we can learn from the British Labour Party. My name is Jill Zippin. I am chair of Democratic Jewish Outreach Pennsylvania and a proud member of the Jewish Battleground Coalition. The Jewish Battleground Coalition, in addition to Pennsylvania, is made up of Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Texas, Florida, and Georgia. We formed this coalition, as Hillary said, we are better together. We know how important it is this year to hold both the House and the Senate. But the Jewish Battleground Coalition is not just about the battleground. As our name says, we are Jewish. We care deeply about the issue of anti-Semitism, which brings us here today. We are all familiar with anti-Semitism on the right, from the neo-Nazi movement to the KKK to the Proud Boys. However, anti-Semitism on the left is often less overt and presents itself differently than anti-Semitism on the right, although it is no less insidious. We as Jews often feel squeezed as anti-Semitism comes from both sides. Michelle Goldberg of the New York Times wrote a piece on anti-Semitism yesterday, which you may have seen, and I believe it is worthwhile to read a few paragraphs from it before we start this presentation. It's called Anti-Semitism Increased Under Trump, and then it got even worse. When speaking about anti-Semitism, she said conservatives might be tempted to blame strident anti-Semitism on anti-Zionism, and that's part of the story. It's clearly anti-Semitic when Israel's enemies blame all Jews for the country's treatment of the Palestinians. According to the ADL report of 2,717 anti-Semitic incidents in the United States last year, 345 involve references to Israel and Zionism. These examples detailed in the report aren't ambiguous. They include Palestinian supporters pushing a man in a yarmulke into a glass window yelling, "Die Zionists." It's a mistake to associate all of the 345 incidents with the left, 68 were propaganda efforts by white supremacist groups to foment anti-Israel and anti-Semitic beliefs. For a huge number of anti-Semitic episodes, the political motive, if there is one, is illegible. According to Greenblatt, more than 80% of the incidents documented in the ADL report cannot be attributed to any specific extremist group. Goldberg concludes, with respect to anti-Semitism, besides being a crisis, escalating anti-Semitism is a warning. Things are falling apart. Anti-Semitism is rising around the globe, and we as Jews are the canary in the coal mine. We have two fabulous speakers with us today, Ari Mittleman and Joan Ryan, who's joining us today from London. Both speakers, after introductions, will give opening remarks, and then we will do some Q&A. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we will do our best to get to them. I'm going to begin with an introduction first of Ari Mittleman and then of Joan Ryan. Ari Mittleman works at the nexus of politics, policymaking, and the press in Washington, D.C. Proficient in both modern and biblical Hebrew, he has formally studied the language and traditional Jewish texts since kindergarten and travels regularly to Israel. He is the founder and host of PA Political Podcast, the first ever podcast dedicated to PA politics. He is the founder of Keystone Strategy and Advocacy, where he runs public relations and advocacy campaigns, and he's worked with high-end clients like Richard Gere. He has worked for U.S. Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania for 8 years. He planned and executed Bob Casey's first trip to Israel and was an advisor during these 8 years on issues of importance to the Jewish community. As a native Pennsylvanian actively involved in the Jewish community, the tragedy in Pittsburgh deeply affected him. After the horrors of the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting in October of 2018 and the killing of 5 people in a kosher grocery in Jersey City, New Jersey, he felt like he needed to express himself about the rise of anti-Semitism, which led to his book, The Paths of the Righteous. And I'm going to show you this book. It's available for purchase on Amazon, and we will put the link in the chat at a discounted rate. Joan Ryan is featured in this book, which came out in February. Paths of the Righteous tells the story of 8 non-Jews, 4 men and 4 women, coming from a variety of backgrounds and nations, who demonstrated unparalleled support for Israel and the Jewish people during perilous times. Ari is a new father, lives in Pikesville, Maryland, with his wife and daughter. Joan Ryan was elected to the Labour Party Member of Parliament in 1997 and was elected to that position a total of 5 times. She served as assistant whip under Tony Blair from 2002 to 2006. She became chair of Labour Friends of Israel in 2015, an organization dedicated to strengthening the relationship between the UK and Israel. It supports a 2-state solution to the Israel-Palestinian conflict and works closely with the Israel Labour Party to reduce violence and spread democracy. Joan, before entering politics, was a teacher and also worked as an oral historian at London's Imperial War Museum in the 1980s, interviewing Holocaust survivors. The horror of their experiences stayed with her and influenced her thinking as it relates to Israel, anti-Semitism, and the Jewish community. Joan, who isn't Jewish, believes that her Irish heritage also helped shape her attitudes towards anti-Semitism and racism. Joan quit Labour at the height of the anti-Semitism crisis, which infected the Labour Party under the hard left leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, and she left the House of Commons in 2019. She will discuss with us today the rise of Corbyn and the anti-Semitism that he perpetuated and its impact on the Labour Party, and what this could mean for us in the US and our political system. Joan is currently the UK head of the London office of ELNET, a nonprofit which works to strengthen ties between Europe and Israel. In addition to its London base, it has offices in Paris, Berlin, Brussels, and Warsaw. ELNET's high-level delegations to Israel have a crucial role to play in building support for Israel and a greater understanding of the challenges it faces. We're going to start with opening remarks, and we're going to begin with Ari Mittleman. Take it away, Ari.
Well, thank you so much, Jill. Thank you, everyone, for taking time on your Sunday morning. Today, actually, this afternoon, rain or shine here in Maryland, we're having a 2-year-old birthday party for our daughter. And if we think of everything that's happened over the last 24 months for our country, for our community, for our world, it's pretty uncertain, pretty unprecedented times. Last week we should stop and we should reflect. The last week was the 3rd year anniversary of that horrible shooting outside of San Diego on the last day of Pesach in 2019. So I mention all this to start because my wife and I, certainly during her pregnancy, and then over the last 24 months, we've literally almost every night we've had conversations after we put our daughter to bed of what's it going to mean to be a young woman with an overtly Hebrew name, as her daughter has, to grow up in a home that cares deeply about our faith, that cares deeply about the United States and our values in the United States, and cares deeply about the U.S.-Israel relationship. And I'm sure that's something that everyone on this call has reflected on, whether you have a 2-year-old or not. So in short, that's really how my book and this project of the last 3 years or so began. Growing up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, if I had to list the top 10 things I wanted to be when I grew up, author certainly wouldn't have made the top 20. I never set out to write a book. But the truth is, also growing up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, walking every Saturday, every Shabbos to and from synagogue, I never, I think in my wildest dreams, going to the Jewish day school up there, in my wildest dreams, or I should say my worst nightmares, I don't think I ever could have imagined what unfolded that horrible October morning in Pittsburgh, a community that I got to know quite well through my work with Senator Casey. So really just the way the last 3 years has just been turned upside down. It was a tough time. It was an emotional time. It would have been very easy to be pessimistic, to kind of wallow in our sadness. But through sleepless nights, I set out quietly to look for positive stories. And that's really the essence of my book. And there's probably thousands of stories out there. I profile 8, 4 men, 4 women, some from the United States, some from abroad, Black, white, and Latina. And, they, for me, during these uncertain emotional times, they've really been an antidote. Hopefully, and thank God we've had a lot of momentum since the launch of the book in February. The feedback we're getting is that they've been an antidote, and they've been a real uplift for folks who've read it. So President Kennedy, I'm mentioning President Kennedy in honor of Joan. So President Kennedy famously said that we're not here to curse the darkness, but to light a candle. And the process of writing this book has really taught me to light a candle, and that's really the kind of optimism and the focus that as she gets older and older, we're trying to instill in our daughter. So we're really fortunate today to have Joan. I met Joan in person. I guess it was just a week or so before the entire world shut down in March of 2020. And I pitched her this idea. I told her that this book project had begun. She was kind enough through the powers of Zoom, as London was turned upside down, as Washington was turned upside down in the spring of 2020, to give me her most valuable resource, her time. And our conversations veered between the personal and the philosophical and everything in between. The truth is, Joan, I'll end with this. I think she deserves her own standalone book, but I think the best chapters have yet to be told, because she's hard at work. She's no longer reporting to Parliament each and every day, but she's doing incredibly noble work. But with that, I'll hand it over to Joan to share some introductory remarks.
Thank you, Ari. Thank you, and hello, everybody. It's late afternoon here in London, and it's a little overcast. Just thinking back, Ari, to all those conversations we had, and we were all in lockdown. I think I had withdrawals when we'd finished. I missed you. So it's lovely to be here with you today, and thank you to Jill for giving me this opportunity. Perhaps I'll start with, you say about my Irish heritage. I mean, Ireland isn't particularly known for being for standing up strongly to anti-Semitism. In fact, perhaps its history would tell us the opposite, its culture and ethos and things. But for my family, my mum and dad came to the UK in the 1940s, and they were poor, and they faced a lot of prejudice in the UK at that time. The Irish were, I guess, because they didn't join in the Second World War, and after 700 years of being really a colony and oppressed, and the whole relationship with the UK was very close, but also very difficult. That's a lot less true today. So they faced a lot of prejudice, and they were very poor, and it was hard to find a place to live. But their response wasn't to become bitter and to hate people or to be angry. They were really hard workers. They were determined that me and my three sisters would all go to university, which was kind of unusual then, and for a family who were not from a professional class or didn't have professional jobs. So that was their focus. And so what they believed in was social justice, and they brought us up to believe the same. And they were involved in a thing called the Irish Club, which it was a club, and people met there and had a nice time. The community came together there and supported each other, especially when there were, people who were not with their families. They were working and living in England, but they were all from Ireland, and they'd help each other. Help them when they had to go home for weddings or funerals, help them to get a nice suit or a little suitcase or have some money in their pocket. They'd do a collection for them so that they could go home with dignity and tell their families, yes, the streets were paved with gold, they were doing well, and their families wouldn't then worry about them. So I think that's where my politics came from, that kind of recognition of the difficulties of life and the inequalities of life, and the importance of looking after each other. So I would say that's the driving force behind my politics. And so I joined the Labour Party as a student. The founding principle of the Labour Party is equality. And that was really important to me. So you can imagine when the anti-Semitism crisis hit in the Labour Party, it was unbelievable. The very party that should be the bulwark against anything like that was in fact the perpetrator. And at the time, I was the chair of Labour Friends of Israel. And so I was kind of catapulted into the forefront of standing up to this. But it wasn't difficult to be in the forefront, because the really sad truth was that very few people decided to stand up to it. People who should have done, and people who didn't. People whose values and principles would have meant that they should have done, and they didn't. I made a lot of commitments to the Jewish community as this terrible crisis unfolded. And I reached a point where, and I think I always knew I would reach it, where I had to stand shoulder to shoulder with the community and fulfill those commitments. And that in the end meant leaving the Labour Party, which I knew meant that when the next general election arrived, I wouldn't be a member of Parliament, because independents, I wasn't going to stand as an independent. Independents don't get elected here. But I knew it would make an impact if I resigned from the Labour Party. I knew it would matter. And you only get a chance to do that once. They were after me anyway. They were pursuing me, determined to try and deselect me. And my decision was I'd make it count. That if I stood up and left the party after not being selected, then it wouldn't really, it would be seen as sour grapes. It was really important to do it at the right time. I left the party really because it was clear by the time I left that it had become institutionally anti-Semitic. I'd been in the party for 40 years. So you can imagine if you're, in a party for that length of time, everybody I knew, all my friends are in the party. I met my husband through the party. Glad to say he stuck with me. my kids were in the party. It becomes like my job was about the Labour Party. Everything was about the Labour Party. So it was, it was very difficult in the year after I left to have done that. Because all your kind of network, your friendship and social network and work network all breaks down at once. But I've never regretted it for a minute. I've always known it was the right thing to do. I can hold my head up. I don't need to answer to anybody for having done the wrong thing, because I think I did exactly the right thing. But I think there's a really important message here about what can we learn from this. And I have thought a lot about this. Especially now, because here we've got anti-Semitism. The Community Service Trust have said it's been the worst year for a very long time, a big increase in anti-Semitism. We've seen it spilling out onto the streets. We've seen abuse on the streets. We've not had this for a very long time. So I think that is part of the legacy of what the Labour Party did. And the last conflict saw a big increase. The Guardian of the Walls conflict in Israel saw a big increase in anti-Semitism. But the lessons I think we have to learn there is some read across, I think, to what's happening in democratic politics in America. We know about what is called the squad members of Congress, and we know their politics are very similar, if not the same, as Corbynista politics. And although I'm talking about anti-Semitism from the hard left, I'm very, very conscious that anti-Semitism from the far right has not gone away, and often is more violent than anti-Semitism from the hard left. But of course, the Labour Party was is the official opposition, and is quite likely to be, in power again in, if not the very near future, 5 years down the line. So how could we tolerate as our party of government, or one of the main parties who could be in government, then becoming an anti-Semitic party. And at the last general election, it was never difficult to walk away, because to not walk away, I'd have had to not walk away from the Labour Party and be able to say what I knew needed to be said. I'd have had to ask people to vote for Jeremy Corbyn to become Prime Minister. I can't ask people to vote for an anti-Semite to become Prime Minister. I can't even countenance the idea of having someone with his politics in number 10. And you only have to remember that of all the kind of polling that was being done at the time, it showed that 87% of Jews in the UK regarded Jeremy Corbyn as anti-Semitic, and nearly half of them said they'd consider emigrating should he become Prime Minister. There was a very real sense of fear amongst our Jewish community. How appalling that my party, the Labour Party that I was a member of, should engender that in our community. So what do the lessons I think we can learn? I think there are 5 of them. First of all, I think I'm sure there are others, but 5 main ones. I think it's vital that we confront every instance of anti-Semitism right from the beginning. We don't wait for it to take root. Once the virus takes hold, it spreads with great speed. And too many people in the Labour Party thought it was just a case of a few bad apples. And they thought that for far too long. And by the time the Labour Party became institutionally anti-Semitic, it was too late to root out the Jew haters. Secondly, I think you've got to have very clear red lines. It's absolutely crucial that you know what your red lines are and that you're not willing to compromise on them. I thought we did know that in the Labour Party. But on the left, anti-Semitism and hatred of Israel are utterly intertwined. And though many people in the Labour Party would stand up and speak out against anti-Semitism, they would not stand up and speak out against anti-Zionism. They would not stand up and speak up for Israel. And of course, many of us face that kind of pernicious, I think, and untrue charge that we were simply trying to stifle criticism of Israel. But I think that, that kind of criticism shouldn't stop us from saying very clearly that, in fact, people who won't, particularly politicians, they've stood for election to be, they should be held to account. And if they are not willing at any level to stand up for a Jewish state, if they're going to single out the world's only Jewish state for criticism, they're going to deny Jewish people alone the right to self-determination, I consider that anti-Semitic, pure and simple. If you claim that you oppose anti-Semitism and you won't ever speak up for Israel, then you're not a true ally. And that's all there is to it. We have to know where that dividing line is. I think the third thing to learn is that we've got to offer a moral and an intellectual critique, not simply a political one. The main criticism of Corbyn from Labour moderates throughout at least the first 2 years of his leadership was that he was unelectable. And of course, elected representatives are absolutely, obsessed with electability because they want to carry on being elected. But then we had an election in 2017 and it was much more closely fought than anybody thought it was going to be. And he improved his position. This somewhat undermined that critique about unelectability. And of course, an awful lot of Labour MPs then just faded away. Now, what we should have been saying at the outset was that it was Corbyn's hard left project that was morally wrong, that his hatred of Israel was actually repugnant, and that his tolerance of anti-Semitism and his past association with Holocaust deniers and Jew haters and terrorist sympathizers, people he called his friends, Hamas and Hezbollah. This made him unfit to be Britain's Prime Minister. So I suppose in short, what I'm saying is that our critique should have been rooted in a fear of what he would do in power, not a fear that he wouldn't get into power. The fourth letter is to understand the importance and the limits of leadership. Before Corbyn's election, I think we were very complacent and failed to recognise and challenge the rise of that kind of small but vocal and highly organised hard left fringe, which I think you definitely see in America today. We were dismissing it as an irrelevant minority. But when we lost the leadership, that fringe very quickly became the mainstream. We shouldn't underestimate either the manner in which many moderates, they just simply averted their eyes and kept their heads down once the leadership was captured by the hard left. And that's why I'm talking about the people who you would think would stand up. Some of those people now are front bench politicians, will be ministers if there's a Labour government. They did not speak up. It's no use looking backwards and condemning them and saying none of them should be there. They have got good values and principles, but they need leadership. Leadership is so important. There was many MPs who the Jewish community had traditionally considered their allies, and they just simply melted away when it became politically expedient for them to do so. We need to be clear that the true test of an ally is how they behave when times are difficult, not when times are easy. And the final lesson, I think, is that we have got to build a wider case about why anti-Semitism matters to the Jew and the non-Jew alike. I met with Keir Starmer a week ago, who's now the leader of the Labour Party, and he is making changes. There's a lot more to do, but he started that change for the good. And I said to him, you have the strength I had in that neither of us are Jewish. That is a strength, because we need to say to people, anti-Semitism isn't just an issue for Jews, it's an issue for all of us. And the reason why is because anti-Semitism, it spreads and it rots the body politic. It threatens democracy. It kills free speech. It destroys any kind of normal or rational or evidence-based thought. It's about all of us. And who wants their children, Ari's 2-year-old, or my grandchildren, who wants these generations to grow up in a society riven by hatred? Let's not imagine that it stops with the Jews, because we know it doesn't. Everybody, if you want a decent society, has got a vested interest in standing together against what is really just racism against Jews. And when we did focus groups, we found that when we said anti-Semitism, some of the people were saying, what? Well, yeah, what is it? How does it work? And when we said racism against Jews, no, we don't. No, that's not right. Then they got it. So we've got to think of how we talk to people about this. The good news, I think, is that we don't need to be downcast, despite how awful anti-Semitism is, because I think the final lesson now in the UK is that it can be tackled, but it's always going to have to be a battle that is always going to be fought. And I said that to Keir Starmer as well. That fight will never be over. But Jeremy Corbyn is no longer in the Labour Party. He's had the whip withdrawn. He won't, therefore, hopefully won't get elected as an independent if he even stands. Thousands of anti-Semites have been kicked out of the Labour Party. The Labour Party is on the road back to being a decent party. and hopefully will never again be overtaken by a crisis such as this and a disease, because it run through the Labour Party like a disease.
Joan, I'm gonna stop you there and start to ask some questions, and this is a perfect note on which to stop. So the question is both for you, Joan, and for you, Ari. You know, obviously you work for Senator Casey and are very familiar with American politics. So do you see differences between Corbyn-supported anti-Israel advocates in Great Britain and those who are viewed as anti-Israel in the Democratic Party, or even in the Republican Party in the US? What similarities do you see? What differences do you see? Let's start with you, Ari, and then we'll go to Joan.
Well, I would just say from the beginning, I wrote my book in such a way that whether or not people love Netanyahu, hate Netanyahu, don't even know who Netanyahu is, they'll hopefully find something. And fortunately, the momentum in the sales, it seems like they have. So the book is not political. That being said, as Jill mentioned, you know, I did have the honor for 8 wonderful years to rack up north of 100,000 miles with Senator Casey, and now remain quite active in not only Pennsylvania, but in national politics, more so from the donor side of things. The something that I've felt and I've suspected a long time, I think was made abundantly clear this past week, where you had a vote in the United States House in support of our brothers and sisters in Ukraine that passed overwhelmingly, completely overwhelmingly. I think there were something like 10 who voted against it. But when you take a look at those who voted against it, this had to do with it was asset seizure and forfeiture. You had, and you know, it's important to name names. You had Marjorie Taylor Greene and Madison Cawthorn and Tom Massey and that crowd. And those are folks that elicit strong responses and I think amongst the audience here. But you also had Rashida Tlaib, you had Ilhan Omar, you had Cori Bush, and you had AOC. And I've suspected, I've wondered, I've had late conversations at a Shabbos dinner table about, you know, how similar is the hard right and the hard left. And I think there are actually beginning just in that vote, I think there are elements that we're seeing when it comes to their foreign policy worldview. There's a hell of a lot of similarities.
Joan, what are your thoughts, again, between Corbyn support, you know, Labor, and either, you know, in the Democratic Party or even in the Republican Party? What do you see as similarities?
I think there are similarities in that for the hard left here, they only have to say the word Palestine, and it's like a flag they've waved to everybody about what their politics are. So Israel-Palestine is like a symbolic issue for them, that whereby they can demonstrate their politics, and they need to have a victim, and the victim is the Palestinians. So they're very much into this victim villain narrative. Why Israel? Well, they see capitalism as the root of all the world's ills. It is reasonably simplistic. That's the root of all the world's ills, capitalism. And so America and Israel, who is under the influence of America, these are the enemy. And I think the hard left around the world pretty much sign up to that kind of analysis. They have a kind of Marxist-Leninist analysis going on. And so they saw Soviet Russia as defeated by capitalism, couldn't exist at this sea of this island of socialism in the sea of capitalism. And so they've always had an alignment with Russia, despite the fact that that now seems completely at odds with the reality of the situation, and possibly always was. And that's why also I think they're so sympathetic with terrorist organizations, with Iran, with Hezbollah and Hamas, because my enemy's enemy is my friend, and they're all they're all victims of capitalism as far as they're concerned. And I think that's what underlies the politics of the hard left and their antipathy and hatred of Western democratic politics and society.
That's very interesting. It's an interesting perspective that I don't think we think about a lot here when it comes to anti-Semitism. So in the news recently, the Harvard newspaper, the Crimson, came out in favor of BDS. They had taken positions against BDS in the past, but on Friday came out in favor of it, yet at the same time claimed to be opposed to anti-Semitism. BDS is a hot topic in our community. I would like to hear both of your thoughts with respect to this particular incident and with respect to BDS. And in a little bit of a more nuanced commentary, do you believe a distinction can be made between BDS against Israel and BDS against settlements? Can either or both be considered anti-Semitism? Again, we'll start with you, Ari, and then move on to you, Joan.
So I'll admit that I saw the headline. I did not read the opinion column. And I also don't know, I'm going to ask a rhetorical question, but it's a question that I think is worth asking anytime there's a conversation about BDS. Did the Harvard Crimson or did the Harvard student body have any similar conversations about divesting Harvard's very, very, very large endowment funds from any Russian assets? Did that conversation happen? Are there people marching down the yard there at Harvard having conversations about just the utter atrocities that the Putin regime is perpetrating? I think those are questions worth asking. I certainly had these conversations at the height of the war in Syria, when you had members of Congress taking to the floor, speaking about Israel, but they were silent when it came to war crimes from the Assad regime. And it just makes me wonder about a double standard there. There's one profile in my book. So as I mentioned, I profile 8 incredible non-Jews who've gone above and beyond for our community in recent years. There's one, in addition to Joan's incredible work on BDS, of a young African-American woman who, while she was a student down in New Orleans, really did some very creative and continues to do some very creative messaging on this. But I'd hand it over to Joan.
Yes, Joan, what are your thoughts on BDS, and are you having similar problems with it in Great Britain and Europe?
Well, London is often called the BDS capital of the world. And we've just not long had what's called Israel Apartheid Week, which is all about, so what if Israel's apartheid, then what do we do? Or we'll boycott it. So it's this notion which is highly offensive to Israel and equally offensive, I think, to people who lived under the apartheid regime in South Africa when it existed. Israel is not an apartheid state, and I think boycotts, the BDS movement is anti-Semitic, and I don't see any difference between boycotting settlements and boycotting Israel itself. We know it's remarkably unsuccessful, economically speaking. The amount of focus there's been in the UK on campuses around this, and yet all during this BDS movement, trade with Israel has absolutely blossomed, and we've moved in the UK now from friendship to partnership in trade terms. I don't think it's about that any longer, if it ever was. I think the real worry has to be, and we have to fight it, is that it is so prevalent on campuses. It's about poisoning the hearts and minds of young people. And I know in America, and a little bit here, perhaps more in America, people tell me they're very worried about young Jewish people on campus who are being made to feel they can't stand up for Israel, or even learning to disapprove of Israel themselves. So I think these are concerns. And when we think that at university, sometimes that's the pipeline to a lot of these kind of roles in life later on, where you become an elected representative, or you've got senior jobs in all kinds of decision-making bodies and all kinds of professions. If they're poisoning the hearts and minds of the young people who will move into those roles later in their lives, because they've got access to them on campus, I think that is a major concern. Now, we are legislating in this country at the moment to stop local authorities divesting their pension funds from anything that has an Israeli connection. Michael Gove, who's a Conservative member of the cabinet, is doing excellent work there, making sure that, and I think we do have to legislate. Local councils are not entitled to have a foreign policy, certainly not one that's based on anti-Semitism.
And it is interesting, if you've been following the news in Pennsylvania and New Jersey at all, you know, it was Yom HaShoah, and Rutgers University AE Pi students were reading names of Holocaust victims, and their fraternity house was egged during this, which is horrific. And I got a call recently from someone who was running for Congress in a Democratic primary a couple years ago. Her daughter is head of the Hillel at Westchester, and in front of the Hillel, people were screaming anti-Semitic comments, including that Jews were child murderers and things like that. And this is happening on college campuses to our children. I am a strong believer in free speech, but certain things do cross the line, and throwing eggs and calling Hillel students murderers is just not so great.
I've done quite a bit of work with Stand With Us. I know that they're strong in America as well.
There's many organizations who are doing it, but obviously a lot of it, I think, comes down to some of the universities taking a stand. And it's often very difficult to get these universities to take a stand.
Same.
Yes, I'm sure it's the same there as well. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel. Criticism of Israel policy is much different than saying Israel should not exist. I think all on this Zoom understand you can criticize Biden or Boris Johnson and still think America or Great Britain should exist. And the same is true of Israel. You can dislike the policies of a member of parliament or the prime minister, but Israel should exist. Frequently, we hear the refrain from the river to the sea, and sadly, in social justice spaces, where we as Democrats believe, we and members of the Labor Party, I would believe as well, have a home. How do we change this narrative, and how do you distinguish between criticism of Israel policy and saying Israel should not exist? We'll go to you, Joan, then to you, Ari.
Oh,
go ahead. Yeah,
sorry.
Yeah, Joan, I'm sorry.
It's to Ari because we've done it that way.
No, I'm sorry. Go to you. We'll start with you, Joan. I changed
Okay.
it up a little bit.
Well, you're absolutely right, Jill, that, you know, there's a significant difference between criticising a government or a prime minister or a president than questioning the right of Israel to exist. And I know that Jews all around the world, and particularly in Israel, criticise their government all the time, like the rest of us do, and that's fine. But that is very different from calling for a country not to exist. I think one of the things we have to do is, in this here in the UK, and it sounds like it's very much the same in the States, and it's certainly the case at the UN, is an absolute obsession with Israel. And they're being held to a different standard than any other democratic country. We look at the number of resolutions at the UN that are about Israel and critical of Israel. And then we look at, and this is something Ari's just referred to as well in the previous question, we look at the number of times Syria comes up, or Iran's behaviour, or what's going on in Yemen, and now the Ukraine. I mean, let's face it, what's happening in the Ukraine's been going on for 8 years. It's not new. And yet you would think the biggest problem anywhere in the world is Israel, if you looked at what happens at the UN. And it's the same if you look at debates here in our parliament. The focus on Israel is something like 5 times anywhere else. It's more than that at the UN. And I don't know what the figures are for Congress or the Senate in America, but I would be surprised if it was radically different. So we have got to talk in the right way about Israel and be open about it, but we've got to end this obsession in politics, this obsessive focus on Israel in this negative way. And I think we've got to work hard to ensure that political parties and political, members of Congress, members of our parliament here, adopt a more balanced policy in relation to the Middle East by putting pressure on to make sure that they do that. And we've got to encourage them to normalize the dialogue around Israel, to normalize the rhetoric around Israel. And we'll only do that if we do what I suggested in my first lesson, is you always stand up to anti-Semitism and call it out. And the IRA definition needs to be more than something just written on a piece of paper that people say they're signed up to. We need to know, what are they doing to put it into practice? Because if they were putting it into practice and looking at the examples around Israel, then we would be tackling this very problem.
Thank you. Ari, would you like to add, talking about criticism of Israel versus Israel should not exist, the dynamic between those two things?
Well, I would agree, per usual, wholeheartedly with Joan. And it's a distinction I personally do not understand. And I think it's important. And I think now, over the last 66 days of this awful war, that each and every one of us, the 49 people gathered on this Sunday morning, just take a time and if we have slightly different perspective than what Joan said or what I'm about to say, to just recognize that what we're doing right now, talking openly about our faith, talking openly, period, having a free conversation with people across state lines, with someone across international borders, that does not happen in many countries in the Middle East. And it's certainly not happening in the Russian Federation. Yeah, so when we're talking about the future of Israel, when we're talking about boycotting or divesting in Israel, what we're talking about is a slap in the face of democracy. And that I think 67 days ago was maybe a more academic discussion. I think we're seeing, if we choose to look, it's very clear the difference between democracy and autocracy. And Israeli politics is messy, but I'm a Maryland voter. I have no place to criticize what's happening on the floor of the Knesset, unless and until my family makes Aliyah. But what I do know is there's a debate happening on the floor of the Knesset. And, America certainly has partners across the Middle East, but some of those partners do not have elected multi-party parliaments. And the ones that do, they don't necessarily have free and robust debate like they do in the House of Commons or in the Congress.
So you touched on something, and Joan has touched on this too. American Jews and Jews around the world are blamed for policies of a country of which they are not even citizens. Many were angry and upset when Chinese Americans were blamed for COVID. Why then are people not upset the Jews are blamed for everything that happens in Israel? Why is simply being Jewish a fault for a cause or a fault line for anti-Semitism? We'll go to you, Ari, and then back to Joan.
I guess the way I would answer that, there's folks that say that anti-Semitism is the oldest form of hatred in this world, and that's probably a academic discussion to be had. But I think going back to biblical times, we certainly can point to Esau, but that's neither here nor there, perhaps. The Congress mandated in 1990 that the FBI needs to start keeping hate crime statistics. And unfortunately, we've seen just in recent years, these numbers have gone up exponential rates. And it's disgusting. There's no other adjective that comes to mind of what we've seen in the last 2 years against Asian Americans. But at the same time, we've also seen, and the ADL report came out this past week, but our own FBI has the same exact statistics, that the crimes against our community have been they've been on the rise. We saw how this year began in outside of Fort Worth, Texas. So once again, that's really what kind of compelled me to put pen to paper and to start this book. So I don't know, Jill, if that answered the question.
It does. I would also ask it of Joan, why are Jews in Europe or Great Britain or in the United States blamed for the policies of Israel with whom they disagree? I will add, my husband and I were recently in Europe, and some of what we're talking about really hit home. We were in Spain, in a country of 86 million people. 86 million, there are only 7,000 Jews, and the majority of them are immigrants from other countries. We were in Portugal, and we were told that the Portuguese Jewish community will not report the numbers out of fear of anti-Semitism. To get into a synagogue in Portugal, there was immense security required, including turning over of passports, and the number in Portugal is smaller than the number in Spain. And when you look all over Europe, the number of Jews is very, very small. And the places where we have found safe haven are in the United States and in Israel. Yet with the small number, literally minuscule number of Jews often throughout Europe, we're still blamed for the policies of Israel. So can you speak to that, Joan?
Can I just say something very quickly? You prompted. No, I'm buying John some time there. But I hadn't thought about this until Jill's points. My wife and I went on our honeymoon in 2013 to France, and we went as we do each and every week. We went to synagogue, but we didn't register. It didn't occur to us to register. And it became an entire discussion outside with non-Jews guarding the synagogue. I won't say in which city, it was in the south of France, who had automatic weapons about whether or not the name in my passport, my legal name is Aryeh Eliezer Mittleman, was Jewish enough, and if we could come in and all of this. And ultimately, once we got in, this was in 2013, less than a decade ago, the folks inside had a good laugh, but they also said, look, we don't wear any necklaces anymore. We don't wear anything overt. And we, so anyhow, the plane ride home from France at the end of that week, we got into this debate. It was our first debate as a married couple, whether or not this would ever happen in the United States. I don't know about each of you, but at synagogue yesterday, unfortunately, we had county police officers sitting in the parking lot. Thank God nothing's ever happened, as far as I know, in the state of Maryland, but there's still county police officers that sit in the parking lot of our synagogue. That should not happen as America's celebrating its 250th birthday in just a few years.
Yeah, and I will add, my synagogue has, you can't enter without a special card, and there are armed guards. So yes, we have that as well. So Joan, could you speak to the issue of why Jews are blamed for Israel policies and the declining number of Jews in Europe?
Well, I think the obvious answer, as unacceptable as it is that it's the Jewish state. And so Jews around the world will be blamed. I hold an Irish passport as well as a British passport because I'm entitled to, because my parents were born there. And my kids are entitled to because their grandparents were born there. Just like with Israel, you only need one grandparent born in Ireland and you can have Irish citizenship in the shape of your applying for a passport. But nobody blames me for policies in Ireland. So nobody should be blaming Jews around the world for whatever the politics of Israel are. But I think it's just it's an easy target, isn't it? They're coming from left and right, and like you say, you're a minority. And there's only about 250,000 Jews in the UK, and I know that the Jewish population has still not reached the level it would have been at had the Holocaust not happened. So, you know, it's around many. I was in Poland recently, and there's around about 8,000 Jews in Poland, and that could be an overestimate. It's somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000. So, right, you know, and Poland was the Jewish capital of the world in many ways prior to the Second World War. So across all these European countries, France has particular issues, and we see right-wing politics there. Marine Le Pen did a lot better than she did last time, although she was roundly beaten in the second round by Macron. You know, there's a lot of people voting for people like Zemmour and Le Pen. These are worrying times. Xenophobia has grown in the UK, particularly since the Brexit debate. I don't think President Trump has helped in America in terms of, you know, as good as people say he was on Israel. He didn't start out that way, did he? You know, he had to be persuaded that this was an electoral asset to be pro-Israel. But the rise in populism, you reach a point whereas if you encourage a rise in populism, which I think he did, and I'm not anti-Republicans, but I worry about the rise in populism that he engendered, because you can't then control, you can't say we just don't like this group, or we just, you know, hatred spreads, it grows, and it becomes violence.
I agree with you. It is a cancer. Anti-Semitism and hatred of others is a cancer. We're nearing the end of our conversation, but I do want to say that according to polling, approximately 70% of Jews in the US identify as Democrats, and anti-Semitism is an issue they care about. Yet there is the specter of anti-Semitism within our own party, and I think we as both Jews and Democrats need to be reflective of that. We as Jews are being squeezed by both sides, as I said at the outset. Donald Trump enabled the Proud Boys, the neo-Nazis, and all sorts of hatred. But that doesn't mean we cannot be self-reflective and look at it globally, including what is happening in the Democratic Party, because that makes us better and will make us better. I think the wonderful thing about being a member of the Democratic Party is that we are often self-reflective. And I think it's important to keep our house free of the oldest hatred. I do want to thank Ari and Joan for being with us today. I could talk for another hour. It's such an interesting topic. Please buy Ari's book. It's called The Paths of the Righteous. There's a discounted link where you can buy the book. It's available on Amazon as well. I read the book in one sitting. It is really, really interesting. And if you're upset about anti-Semitism and Jew hatred, it's a very uplifting book to show there are people across the globe, across genders, across races, and even across party lines who care about the Jewish community. I just want to remind everybody, there's a great event tomorrow at 5 o'clock called State of the Race. The links are in the chat. or you can go to DJOP website to get a link. On May 11th and 12th, JDCA is going to have lobby days where we're going to talk about the issue of Israel and anti-Semitism. So I encourage you as well to sign up to talk to your elected officials about these very important issues. The 3 topics will be Israel, anti-Semitism, and preservation of democracy. And if you happen to be in PA and like brunch and Josh Shapiro, please join us for an event in support of Josh Shapiro at my home. I promise delicious food. Josh Shapiro and Madeline Dean will be introducing him if you happen to be local. Joan, if you're in the area, or Ari, you're welcome to come to Pennsylvania to Horsham. I know there's a Horsham in Great Britain, but I live in Horsham, Pennsylvania. So I hope everyone is able to make that event. Again, thank you for all who have signed on to this call. This has been recorded and I will send everybody out a video link shortly. And again, thank you to our wonderful guests for a very interesting and informative discussion. Thank you. And I guess it's now good afternoon. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.